Padre Pio's feast day is September 23rd. Now, I've read a bunch about him, biographies, collections of his sayings, reflections on them, and I've taught about him in my confirmation class, but I never really say I know the man. I always feel when reading these things that Padre Pio is holding something back, and I've always attributed it to the fact that, well, I guess he's a very private person, so it's hard to get to know him if he's fine. He doesn't want to share. So when teaching about him in my 8th grade religion class over at Thomas More, I would concentrate on spiritual consolation and on private revelation. That's what I would talk about with regards to Padre Pio. And spiritual consolation helps explain a lot of why we're fascinated by the man. Pope Francis described spiritual consolation in a papal audience. He said, "Consolation is light in the soul. It is interior joy. It helps you see God's presence in everything. It strengthens faith and hope. It supports you in the face of difficulties because the peace you experience is stronger than any trial. You can't control spiritual consolation. It doesn't happen through our efforts. It's a gift of the Spirit, given when God knows you need it the most. Consolation is more profound than human enthusiasm. It isn't working yourself into a frenzy. False consolation exhausts you. Real consolation energizes you. And consolation enables us to trust in God and take risks that we would never have the courage to do on our own." Which brings me to Padre Pio's stigmata. He received the wounds in 1918, and he had them until his death in 1968. And this is where we get distracted in trying to understand who Padre Pio was. The stigmata and the other mystical experiences of his life, his bilocations, his prior knowledge of penitent sins, his prediction that Karol Wojtyła would be made pope, and others, are all very distracting things. And so I always tell my students that the stigmata were a private devotion of Padre Pio. And my proof that he saw it as a private devotion, well, he didn't want doctors looking at the wounds. He would wear dark gloves and oversized vestments to hide his wounds while saying Mass. He wanted to keep it private. It was a consolation, it was a gift that Christ gave to him. Which brings up a question: how can open wounds that bled continuously for 50 years be a consolation? And it's because it united him to Christ. You see, being spiritually consoled doesn't mean you won't suffer. It doesn't mean life will be easy and you will always be happy. Spiritual consolation's interior joy comes from doing God's will, not from living a pain-free life. Padre Pio gave a glimpse into his understanding of the stigmata when he said this about suffering: "How unbearable is pain when suffered far from the cross, but how sweet and bearable it becomes when it is offered close to the cross of Jesus." The first part of this quote, "How unbearable is pain when suffered far from the cross," every confessor knows this. So much of the pain of sin is self-inflicted, and in absolution, confessors are healing that pain and restoring people to Christ. The second part of this quote, "How sweet and bearable it becomes when it is offered close to the cross of Christ," is something Padre Pio knew intimately. In his stigmata, he was enduring what Christ endured. And how much closer to Christ can you get? "Pray, hope, and don't worry" is a famous quote of Padre Pio's, but it is much more than just a slogan for a coffee mug. Padre Pio was able to pray that prayer because he knew the love of Christ in the pain of the stigmata. And when we unite our sufferings to the cross of Christ, we can pray it as well.